Well, we need to mobilize around a strong set of working class demands. So this is exactly what our party candidates are running on. Farah read off the list of 12 campaigns, 12 candidates and 12 campaigns that we're going to be running across most of Ontario. Most cities in Ontario have at least one communist candidate. We're very proud of that. What are they going to be running on? Well, you've got the leaflets in front of you, but the pillars, the three pillars of our campaign are an economy that works for people. What does that mean? Well, we're calling for a full employment economy. And you can do that, we can work towards that, but it's going to take political guts, and those political guts are going to be forged by a determined working class who's just not going to demand anything less. How do we do that? Well, we could have a shorter work week with no loss in take-home pay. That would help create jobs. They did it in France back in the 90s, and right away they created almost 250,000 jobs within 6 months.
Wow.
Now, they don't have it anymore because the business community opposed it, but it shows it can be done, and it shows that it has a good effect. We also call for massive investment in infrastructure programs, so things like housing. Jay talked about our housing campaign that we've had. Well, we call for a provincial housing program that's going to build now 200,000 units and upgrade existing units, because there's a massive housing crisis. Jay touched on it, but it's absolutely massive. And we are, sadly, the Communist Party in Ontario is the only party in this province that's actually talking and has been campaigning about confronting and resolving the housing crisis. And that's really disgusting, that it's left to a small party, and it's not even being debated in any kind of mainstream.
Shame.
It is shameful, very shameful. Our economy our economic platform is also based on raising wages. We call for a $20 minimum wage. Why? Because that's a livable level. That's what people need. We supported, the Communist Party supported the $15 in fairness campaign. Absolutely, because it was a step in the right direction. It was a grassroots campaign that for 5 years worked its ass off and actually forced some change. And it was good change. And now it's jeopardized. But we also recognize that's not sufficient. $15, there's people in this room who probably make 15, 14 bucks an hour, and you know that it's hard to live in Toronto on that much money. It's hard to live in Toronto on $18 or $20 an hour if you don't have another income coming in. But $20 has generally been identified as what it would cost for people to have a livable income. And our point is, and we think the point of the working class demand is, why do we talk about minimums? Why don't we talk about what's needed? Why just talk about what's going to keep me from starving is not enough. It's going to keep you from starving, but it's not going to do anything else. We also call for, within our economic package, we call for plant closure legislation that's going to prevent companies, especially those who are making lots of money, from relocating. And a good example that just came up was the Lear Corporation in Ajax. That company, Lear Corporation, made record profits last year. Not just in Ajax, but record profits across their whole organization. And in the first quarter of this year, they reported record quarterly profits. So they had a strike. Unifor had people out on strike there, I think about 300 people. And the company's response was, fine, we're moving production. We're closing the plant and moving production. Well, they've settled. I don't know the terms of the settlement, but chances are, when I've been in the position, and others of you too, when you got a hammer pointed at your face, and you're looking at losing 300 jobs, you're looking at concessions, most times, right? And that doesn't mean that the union's weak or that the workers are weak. It just means they've got to keep their job. What it really means, our attention shouldn't be on those workers, it should be on that damn corporation. Right? And we should be asking the provincial government, we should be asking candidates, we should be asking the labor movement, why don't we push for plant closure legislation to prevent this kind of stuff from happening? If your company's making money, well, there's no excuse to leave just so you can make more. And if you do, we're going to take over your business and we'll run it. The second pillar of our campaign platform is expanded universal public services. And we mean universal. I spoke to that earlier. So we're looking at things like the housing program that I mentioned earlier. And it's not just about building housing and maintaining housing and upgrading it. It's also about rolling back rents and then having rent control. The NDP The one thing they did on housing over the last ages was they pushed for the expanding rent control so that it covered units that were built after 1991. That had been an exclusion in the legislation. What they don't tell you is that they actually introduced that exclusion in 1992 with the Rent Control Act. They agreed in that legislation, you can find it online, they agreed in that legislation to exempt buildings that were built after 1991 from any rent control because they believed that the corporate sector, the private sector would continue to build affordable housing if they didn't have to pay extra. Well, we know exactly what happened. They built lots of housing. They built lots of condos. They knocked down lots of social housing, or they bought it up and then changed it into mixed housing, so that instead of having 100 social units, low-income units, rent-geared income units, they might have 12 and then 60 market rent units. So this is the kind of garbage that's been going on. What happened was, the Tories, when they got in 1995, they thought that was such a brilliant policy of excluding units that they just continued it forever. So the NDP, okay, fine, they wanted to extend rent control. But at this point, rents have been allowed to rise so much that they're up like this, and they're out of reach of most people. Jay said, he commented on the average rent of a one-bedroom apartment in Toronto. It's disgraceful how much it costs. And this is something, it's worse in Toronto than it is other places, but it's something that's affecting almost every area of the province. Substandard housing, huge housing costs, huge rental costs, something like 725,000 households. How many people is that? Like 500,000 people maybe more? 725,000 households in this province live in core housing need. And what that means, it's a defined term, what it means is that they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing that is substandard, that is in need, either crowded or in need of major repairs. Now that doesn't count people who are spending 40% of their income on housing, or 50% or more. If you're apparently it's okay if you spend 80% of your income on housing as long as it doesn't have a leaky roof. We don't think so, but apparently the statistics folks do. But even then, 750,000 households are in core housing need in the province, and that number is growing, and the waiting lists are growing. And this is disgraceful, and there's no action being done. There's no proposals being made by any of the major parties to fix this. We have a plan to fix it. Our plan is to agitate the working class, to get this demand in front of all people who are running in front of the government, up in the election and after the election, because we're going to have to fight like hell afterwards too.
Right.
We also talk about expanding healthcare. We want to have universal pharmacare. We want to have universal eye care. We want to have universal dental care, mental health care, long-term care. All of these things are critical, they're needed, and it's just about treating people with dignity at a certain point, isn't it? I mean, the 17th biggest economy in the world, and people have to live in, in urine-soaked sheets because there's no option that the public or the society provides for them. It's absolutely disgraceful. It's damn got to change. We're calling also for other expansions in services too. Childcare, I mentioned. We're calling for a province-wide system of free childcare. We're also calling for 24-hour childcare for parents who work shifts or parents who have emergencies that they need to leave their child in care for. We're calling for expanded public transit. And again, we're calling for a rollback of fares. They should be fare free transit. If we can afford to build all these car-friendly things, why can we do something that gets people around the city and in between cities, interregional transit, all that? It should be provided free, and that's our demand. Our third I should mention, I forgot to mention also our education policy. We've campaigned for years for a single, secular, quality public school system. Right. And we're pushing that again this year. We've had decades and decades and decades of public money going towards Catholic education in Ontario. There's no reason for it. Our view is that the religious communities themselves should be providing their own religious education. That's their responsibility, and that's their right. But it's not the responsibility of the public, of society as a whole, to educate my kids on some specific religion. It's just not. And when you think about it, how can we even continue this practice anyway? Are we going to continue to pick out one religion from a whole bunch and fund that billions and billions of dollars and say, well, oh, you're Hindu? Tough darts. Sorry. Oh, you're Jewish? Well, have a nice day. You know, you're Muslim? Well, off you go. Oh, but if you're Catholic, well, we'll give you the money. It's absurd, and it needs to stop. And our plan is to stop it. It's to bring all those resources into one secular school system, provide proper funding, needs-based funding, get away from this idiocy of the enrollment-based funding, and to change some of the rules as well, to allow trustees to have some democratic ability and some weight to their work. And the third main pillar of our campaign is for progressive tax reform, because you got to pay for all this, right? I mean, you do. So I'll take another stab at the NDP. Well, first of all, I'll take a stab at the Tories. They just want to cut more taxes, so they're going to send us into a deeper revenue crisis. But they want to talk about it as if it's a spending crisis, which it's not, right? If I just keep taking money out of Ivan's bank account, it doesn't mean he's not spending. He's spending too much. It means he doesn't have money. It's because I'm stealing it. Well, this is exactly what's happening in the provincial treasuries, right? Corporations and the very rich are essentially, through their political parties, stealing public money. Yep. And then we're told we're spending too much. How can we be spending too much? You know, we just don't have the money to spend. So the Tories want to cut. The Liberals aren't talking about it. They simply are not talking about corporate taxation at all. They're actually quite proud that they've continued to cut. And the NDP has said they're going to raise corporate taxes by 1.5%. They're already, Ontario taxes, corporate taxes are already currently the low, now that'll change when Trump's cuts come in, but up until then, they were the lowest in North America. Yep. Not a lot of people know that. And Andrew Horwath's announcement was, well, we're going to make these corporations pay their fair share. We're going to go up by 1.5%. I know my property taxes went up by more than 1.5%. You know, like, I'm sorry, it's not a fair share. But also, it's a drop in the bucket. And she actually said this will still keep us competitive with Trump's tax cuts. So here's this practice of putting fiscal responsibility and capitalist competition above the needs of the working class, above the needs of the people, above the needs of the environment. And that's just wrong. What do we call for? We call for doubling the corporate tax rate. What does this mean? Well, if you add up OPSU, the union, the Ontario Public Service Employees Union, the 2014 election, they produced a fact sheet which talked about corporate taxation in Ontario. And they said if you add up all of the tax cuts from 1995, which is when the Tories were elected with Mike Harris, till now, or till then, till 2014, if you add all of those up, it totals $18 billion every year in lost revenue. Those tax cuts overwhelmingly benefited the big corporations and the very rich. Overwhelmingly. And where there were cuts that came to working class people, they were often offset and then some by higher user fees or reductions on, benefits or something like that. But overwhelmingly, those cuts affected those who can actually afford to pay. $18 billion. What was Kathleen Wynne's proposal for funding her infrastructure plan? It was to sell the single biggest asset that was held publicly in Ontario. And that was, $8 billion, I think, or $9 billion they were looking to get from that. There are not enough assets. There are not enough assets to make $18 billion in privatization money even in 1 year, let alone the next year, and the next year, and the next year. I'm sorry, we have to resolve the revenue crisis, and that means having the guts to force the corporations to pay their fair share. And if they don't, they go under public ownership. If Jean doesn't pay, and I'm not saying you don't do this, but I'm picking on Jean. If Jean doesn't pay her property taxes on her house, that can be taken. And it would be. It would be. But if Jean apparently is a corporation who just doesn't pay, we go like this and we wring our hands till they bleed, and every once in a while there's Star or somebody will do an expose on it, and then maybe we'll guilt Jean into paying some 1 or 2% of that corporate taxes, and then she'll be out of the headlines. That's insufficient. We need to actually change the way that the government approaches taxation and that the government approaches corporations. So these are the three big pillars of our campaign. And there are other elements too. You'll see those in the leaflet. We're calling for justice for Indigenous peoples. We're calling for no development where there's land claims. So when we talk about the Ring of Fire, well, the first thing we got to do is settle those land claims. You know, when we talk about the environment, we reject cap and trade, and carbon taxes. These are just ways to commodify polluting. Yep. I'm a big corporation. I can buy your corporation's pollution limit, and then I'm allowed to pollute. Like, what an absurd and perverse way to approach the pollution question. What we need is just to legislate limits. Say, sorry, you're over your limit, you got to pay a fine, and you got to stop. And if you don't, well, you're going to jail. Like, that's it, Why should we allow this to continue? Why should we commodify it so that it can continue and also raise money at the same time? It's just absolutely warped approach to things. And it's not going to solve climate change. It's not going to resolve the environmental crisis. We also call for democratic electoral reform. And specifically, we've campaigned for years on this. We call for proportional representation. Absolutely. We also call for the right to recall and to lower the voting age to 16. Woo! There's other things in our platform. I encourage you to look at the leaflets, look at the website. The bottom line here, though, I think is that, it's true. Change is definitely in the air with this election campaign. There's no question. I mean, this is the drums of change are beaten away. What we have to do, the task before us, is to make sure that it's the most progressive change possible. And that means that we have to agitate like hell in our ridings. We have to agitate like hell in the ridings where we don't have candidates, and encourage workers and their families and their communities to put forward progressive, meaningful demands to the candidates. And those candidates who pony up, who stand up and say, yeah, this is pretty good stuff. I mean, they're not going to say we endorse the Communist Party's platform, but they might say I agree with 60% of this, or I agree with the guts of this, and I'm willing to fight for it. That person deserves support. They should be elected if they're willing to fight for that. And we got to engage that person and make sure they're part of the fight after the election, because this is another thing that we're campaigning for, is June 8th and June 9th and June 10th and on. Have a Doug Ford government, even if it's a minority, we've got a task cut out for us. And it brings back memories of the Mike Harris government in the 90s and the days of action. We're already part of groups that are meeting. Our comrades and our party officially is already part of meetings that are happening to talk about preparing for that fight back. We're not giving up on this election. We do think that we can fight. The polls are starting to change. People are starting to get more politicized, and we can help that process, and we're going to help that process. But this is exactly what our task is to make sure that we have the most progressive change possible. And in that process, we're going to be working to build this idea of a people's coalition, of a progressive coalition of all of the working class and other sectors of society, Indigenous peoples, youth, women, LGBTQ, environmental activists, racialized and immigrant communities. Build that kind of a coalition that can actually present a people's alternative and fight for it, mobilize for it, day after day. What that's going to do, that's the vehicle for achieving real far-reaching reforms. That's the vehicle for opening the door to even more transformative change. That's the vehicle for igniting the movement for socialism, and that is what we're campaigning for. Thank you very much. Yeah.